On the 30th of July, 1945, the United States Navy simply lost a heavy cruiser. It wasn't just any ship. It was the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, fresh from a mission that would literally change the course of human history. Yet, for 4 agonizing days, nearly 900 men drifted in the shark-infested waters of the Philippine Sea, while the Navy's operational plot boards showed their ship safely arriving in Leyte. How does a 10,000-ton warship vanish without a trace in the middle of a war zone? The tragedy of the Indianapolis is often remembered for the horror of the water, but the true failure began long before the torpedoes struck. It lies in a lethal combination of top-heavy treaty design, a breakdown in communication protocols, and a mission secrecy so absolute it became a death sentence. This is the story of the USS Indianapolis and the strategic flaws that sealed her fate. We will dissect how she was designed and why she failed. To understand why a heavy cruiser was sailing unaccompanied through a known submarine corridor, we must first analyze the operational doctrine that governed her final voyage. The Indianapolis was not operating under standard fleet protocols. She was operating under the shadow of the Manhattan Project. Her mission began in San Francisco, carrying a cargo so sensitive the enriched uranium and firing mechanism for the little boy atomic bomb that her sailing orders overrode standard defensive measures. The Navy prioritized speed above all else. The Indianapolis, with her older reciprocating engines pushed to their limits, raced from the west coast to Tinian Island in a record-breaking 10 days. In this phase, her speed was her armor. She was simply moving too fast for any Japanese submarine to establish a firing solution. But once that cargo was offloaded at Tinian, the strategic equation changed. Yet the operational posture did not. Captain Charles McVay was ordered to proceed to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to prepare for the invasion of Japan. The route took her across the Philippine Sea, a stretch of deep water known to be prowled by the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine fleet. Crucially, our analysis of the routing instructions reveals a fatal lapse in intelligence sharing. Naval intelligence had intercepted signals indicating that a Japanese submarine, the I-58 under Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, was operating in the exact path of the Indianapolis. This intelligence, classified as Ultra, was withheld from Captain McVay to protect the code-breaking source. When McVay requested an destroyer escort for the leg to Leyte, a standard request for a capital ship in hostile water sit was denied. The routing officer at Guam operated under the assumption that a heavy cruiser, capable of over 32 knots, was invulnerable to the slower submerged submarines of the era. This doctrine relied on a dangerous variable, the assumption that the cruiser would maintain high speed. But the Indianapolis was no longer the swift scout cruiser she was designed to be in the 1,930 seconds. She was operating under Condition of Readiness 3, steaming comfortably to conserve fuel, alone in the dark, with no sonar-equipped escort to sweep the depths ahead. The system had prioritized the mission's secrecy so effectively that it blinded the ship to the immediate tactical threat waiting in the black water. To understand why the Indianapolis succumbed so violently to damage that other ships might have survived, we must strip her down to her naval architecture. The Indianapolis was a child of the Washington Naval Treaty, a global arms limitation agreement that legally restricted heavy cruisers to a standard displacement of 10,000 tons. This arbitrary weight limit forced naval architects to make ruthless compromises. In the engineering triangle of speed, firepower, and protection, the designers of the Portland class chose the first two. She was built for 32 knots and carried 9 8-inch guns, but to keep her tonnage legal, her armor protection was stripped to the bare minimum. When we examine the cross-section of the hull, the vulnerability becomes terrifyingly clear. Unlike the battleships of the era, which featured deep, layered torpedo defense systems designed to absorb the energy of an underwater explosion, the Indianapolis had virtually no underwater protection. Her side plating was thin, leading directly into the machinery spaces. There were no heavy torpedo blisters to dissipate the shockwave. She relied entirely on internal subdivision, a series of watertight bulkhead stow-contained flooding. But this passive defense system relied on the ship remaining upright. By July 1945, the Indianapolis was no longer the ship that launched in 1939. Over 4 years of war, she had undergone a massive metamorphosis that fundamentally altered her physics. To combat the kamikaze threat, the Navy had bolted tons of additional equipment onto her superstructure. If we look at the 1,945 refit schematics, we see a forest of new steel growing from her decks. Quad mount, 40 millimeters. Bofors guns, single 20 millimeters. Oerlikons, splinter shields, and heavy fire control radar masts. All of this weight was added high above the waterline. In naval stability terms, this raised the ship's center of gravity, G, dangerously close to her metacenter. This reduced her metacentric height, the lever arm that allows a ship to right itself after rolling. The Indianapolis had become tender, or top-heavy. She was already struggling against the laws of physics, balancing a massive amount of top weight on a narrow, treaty-limited hull. She was sailing with a reduced margin for error. The reserve buoyancy that would normally counter a flood had been eaten away by the sheer weight of her own modern weaponry. She was a glass cannon, lethal on the offense, but brittle structurally. She wasn't built to take a hit. She was built to not get hit at all. At 0:14 on July 30th, the timeline of the Indianapolis compresses from days into seconds. Our forensic reconstruction places the Japanese submarine I-58 on the surface, just 1,500 yards off the cruiser's starboard quarter. Commander Hashimoto fires a spread of 6 Type 95 oxygen torpedoes. The physics of the disaster begins with the first impact. The torpedo strikes the starboard bow, between frames 6 and 7. The warhead doesn't just breach the hull, it violently amputates the first 40 feet of the ship. In a standard static scenario, this damage is survivable. The USS New Orleans survived similar damage in 1942. But the Indianapolis is not static. She is steaming at 17 knots. The severed bow immediately creates a catastrophic hydrodynamic effect. The open hull acts as a massive scoop, forcing thousands of tons of seawater into the forward compartments with the pressure of a fire hose. The ship's forward momentum is now working against her, driving the bow down and the stern up. Seconds later, the second torpedo strikes amidships, directly under the bridge, near frame 46. This is the kill shot. The explosion rips into the adjacency of the aviation fuel tanks and the forward powder magazine. The resulting chain reaction blows upward through the mess hall and officers' quarters, incinerating the sleeping crew. But the critical damage is happening below the waterline. The blast annihilates the ship's forward electrical switchboard. This is the moment the Indianapolis truly dies. In an instant, the ship loses all internal communications, fire pumps, and lighting. She goes dark. Without the internal sound-powered phone circuits, the bridge cannot communicate with the engine room. Captain McVeigh cannot order the engines to stop. The ship continues to power forward, driving herself deeper under the ocean surface. Inside the hull, the watertight bulkheads, the passive defense we analyzed earlier, are failing. The ventilation trunks, which were kept open to relieve the stifling tropical heat, now act as superhighways for the fleet, bypassing the watertight subdivision. This is where the treaty cruiser design flaws from Act 3 become terminal. As the bow fills, the ship begins to list heavily to starboard. Remember the raised center of gravity caused by the wartime refits. As the ship heels over past 15 degrees, that heavy superstructure exerts a massive leverage arm, accelerating the roll. The ship's righting arm, the force that wants to push her back, upright collapses to zero. The crew has no time to launch lifeboats. The list is so severe that the port side boats are hanging uselessly over the deck, and the starboard boats are already in the water. Men are forced to walk on the side of the hull. At 00:27, just 12 minutes after the first impact, the Indianapolis rolls a full 90 degrees. Her stern rises vertical, hundreds of feet into the air, revealing the propellers still slowly turning against the night sky. Then, she slides under. A 10,000-ton capital ship, a city at sea, has been erased in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. She leaves behind approximately 900 survivors, dumped into an oil-slicked, pitch-black ocean, believing that rescue is just hours away. They do not know that their SOS signals, though sent by heroic radio operators using emergency power, will be dismissed as Japanese trickery by the few stations that hear them. The ship is gone, and the silence has begun. The tragedy of the Indianapolis did not end with the sinking. It was compounded by a 4-day silence born of bureaucracy. The ship's distress signals were sent. 3 separate shore stations received the partial SOS calls, but in a cascade of human error, they were dismissed as Japanese deception or ignored by operators who failed to wake their superiors. But the true systemic failure lay in the Navy's movement report protocols. In 1945, the Pacific Fleet operated on an assumption of arrival. If a combatant ship did not arrive at its destination, there was no standing order to report it overdue. The port director at Leyte assumed the ship had been diverted to a new mission. The port director at Tinian assumed she had arrived safely. The Indianapolis fell into a procedural void between 2 commands, existing on no one's active plot board. It took an accidental sighting by a PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber 4 days later to trigger a rescue. By then, exposure, dehydration, and shark attacks had claimed nearly 600 of the 900 men who successfully abandoned the ship. The delay, caused entirely by paper protocols, was more lethal than the torpedoes. The aftermath was a forensic attempt to shift the blame from the system to the individual. Captain McVeigh was court-martialed, the only captain in U.S. naval history to be tried for losing the ship to enemy action. The prosecution focused on his failure to zigzag, a defensive maneuver that Commander Hashimoto himself later testified would have made no difference against the spread of Type 95 torpedoes at such close range. The trial ignored the lack of escort, the withheld intelligence, and the top-heavy instability of the ship. The legacy of the Indianapolis is found in the rewriting of naval procedure. Immediately following the disaster, the Navy overhauled its tracking system, mandating the positive arrival report protocol. Today, no U.S. warship moves without a confirmed electronic handshake at its destination, a safety regulation written in the blood of the Indianapolis crew. Ultimately, the Indianapolis was a victim of the very speed and secrecy that defined her mission. She was a weapon designed to deliver the end of the war, yet she was undone by a treaty-compromised hull and a Navy that forgot to listen. Her wreckage, finally discovered in 2017 3 miles down, stands as a steel monument to the unforgiving reality of naval warfare, that the deadliest enemy is often not the torpedo, but the silence.